In late 2013, Sony released the first full-frame mirrorless camera with autofocus. In early 2020, I bought that camera. This video is sponsored by Skillshare, an online learning community. So yes, I bought the original Sony A7 just a few weeks ago, and I've been playing around with it and having lots of fun with it. Now, before you guys go off and ask all of these questions, inevitably I'm going to answer some of those right off the bat for you. No, I am not switching to full frame, at least not yet. And no, this is not going to be a camera that is replacing my other APS-C mirrorless cameras. In fact, the whole premise of this video really is to talk about the merits of buying an older full-frame camera body as you compare to shopping for a current, let's say, A6100 APS-C camera body. So let's take a closer look at the camera that I think started it all, the Sony A7. Here it is. This is the original Sony A7 in all of its full-frame glory. And you can see that this particular camera is in pretty mint condition. I picked it up with just over 6,000 clicks on it. There are a lot of these cameras on the used market. You do have to look out for a couple of things. Primarily, the screen on the back tends to delaminate and get pretty nasty looking. This screen is a pretty mint example. Also, there are a couple of things that tend to go wrong with these cameras. Internally, at least, from what I've seen in my research, I've seen a couple of these cameras with failed logic boards or power issues. So if you are planning on picking up one of these full-frame cameras used, make sure it is in working condition. So let's start at the front. You can see the full-frame sensor here, and just for comparison, here's my A6100 APS-C sensor. You can see it's about half the size of the full-frame camera. At the top, you get your usual assortment of knobs. You have your mode dial, on-off switch, trigger, an exposure compensation wheel here, as well as an adjustment wheel towards the front that you can use your index finger on, which is very convenient. On the back of the camera, you get a menu button, a nice EVF, a custom 2 button, another wheel for adjusting, an autofocus, manual focus, or AEL switch, a function button, a nice scroll wheel, D-pad. So these controls are all very similar to what you see on an APS-C camera. That record button on the side, Sony has kept it there for years and years and years. The battery on the Sony A7, the exact same thing as what you get on the Sony A6000. On the Sony A7, the SD card slot is here on the side. It just pops in and out. Pretty nice, actually. I like it as opposed to the slot underneath the camera. And then on this side, you have both a microphone jack and a headphone jack, as well as multi-out and HDMI. So you can monitor audio, record external audio, as well as use the built-in microphones. This camera is an interesting value proposition right now because in order for you to get into a full-frame Sony mirrorless camera, that entry level point is the Sony A7 III, which last time I checked is still around $1,800. It's almost $2,000 to get just a camera body. If you pick up a used Sony A7, could you get about 80% of that performance for 25% of the price? Maybe. So first, let's talk about some of the specs of this camera and some of my dislikes. The Sony A7 has a 24.3 megapixel sensor. The APS-C sensor is 24.2 megapixels, so it's the exact same megapixel count. It features 117 hybrid autofocus points as well as 25 contrast detection autofocus points. In comparison, 425 and 425 are the two numbers for the A6100. If you think you might want to shoot sports photography, this is probably not the camera for you because in burst mode with autofocus, that's 2.5 frames per second. 11 frames per second with autofocus on the A6100. The Sony A7 has a 2.4 million dot EVF, which is good even by today's standards. The screen on the back is not very high resolution, but it's fine. It's also not touch sensitive, and it's not one of the flipper screens either. You can't really do selfie vlog status with this camera. Actually, that applies to basically every Sony full-frame mirrorless camera. This camera also does not feature 4K video recording because that was kind of a new phenomenon back in 2013. It wasn't really rolled out to the mainstream. So 1080p, 60 frames per second is the maximum. That is pretty much the gist of all of the features on this camera. The things that I don't really like about it, number one, and this is something that's very common on the A6000 as well, is the mount itself is a little bit loose. So I don't know if you can hear that or not, but every single time you rotate this lens, there's a little bit of play in the mount. It's something that Sony eventually figured out, at least with the A6300, but on the A7, that's kind of annoying. The second thing is ergonomically, it's not a terrible camera, but it does have a very shallow grip, something that is common with the older line, and even the A6100 to this day has a very shallow grip. So if you have larger hands, it's kind of annoying. But I do like all of the extra knobs and dials and controls that are so easily accessible on this full frame body that you just don't have available on the APS-C mirrorless bodies. Number three, the battery life on the Sony A7 is pretty terrible, as you could expect, because it's using a tiny camera battery. Eventually Sony figured this out and they started using the larger Z-type batteries, but with this camera, you really need to have like 2 or 3 extra batteries with you at all times, because I found that it drains very, very quickly, even in comparison to the Sony A6000. And number four, the last thing that I noticed about this camera that was very annoying is the autofocus. The autofocus on the Sony A7 is, well, it reminds me of my old APS-C Canon DSLRs. It's just not very good, not very fast, not very accurate. And it reminds me a lot of why I used these Sony APS-C cameras for all of these years, because the autofocus on Sony's full frame cameras took a while to get up to good standard levels. Don't expect miracles with the autofocus. I took a bunch of sample shots with this, and I probably threw away well over 40% of my shots because they were slightly out of focus or just plainly out of focus. Speaking of sample photos, I suppose I should show you guys what this camera is capable of, but before I do, let's talk about today's video sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of classes for those who are creative, want to be more creative, or maybe are just curious. They offer classes for real life and all of the circumstances that come with it, so you can stay inspired, express yourself, and join a community of millions of others. There's a lot of uncertainty in the world today. What I've personally found is taking a creative class helps me feel like I have some sense of accomplishment. Skillshare offers classes in photography, film, creative design, even YouTubing. Recently, I took a class called YouTube Success, Build an Authentic Channel That's Worth the Follow with Sorel Amour, and while I knew and understood many of the topics that were discussed, for example, setting up a niche and building your channel around that niche, man, would it have been nice to go through this class earlier on in my YouTube career. I would have avoided having to learn from my own mistakes. Skillshare is made for learning, so there are no ads, and they're always launching new premium classes so you can stay focused and follow wherever your creativity takes you. And with an annual subscription, joining the Skillshare community costs less than $10 per month. And because Skillshare is sponsoring this video, the first 1,000 subscribers to sign up using the link down below will get a free 2 months of premium membership. So definitely check out the link down below. Special thanks to Skillshare again for sponsoring. Now, let's take a look at some sample photos that I took using the Sony A7. And all of these shots were done on the Tamron 28 to 75mm f2.8 full frame lens. Here we go. So that's it for the sample photos, and you probably saw in there were a couple of shots that were still ever so slightly out of focus because, again, the autofocus on the Sony A7 just isn't really that great. Beyond that, the optical quality, especially for a 7-year-old camera, is remarkably good. The colors, the dynamic range, and the bokeh are all excellent coming out of this camera, and that probably has something to do with the 28 to 75mm f2.8 Tamron that I have on this camera body, which is an excellent, very sharp lens. Now, it got me to thinking, what would happen if I compared the images coming out of the A7 to the images coming out of, let's say, a Sony A6100 using an equivalent lens? Now, I did a two-way lens comparison in my last video, and I found that the 28 to 75 from Tamron is very close to the performance of the newer Sony 16 to 55. So what I did is I snapped a couple of photos side by side of my wife, a couple of portraits here. So you can see here, not only are the skin tones better on the Sony A6100, but the image is overall much sharper, specifically on the pupils of the eye, as you compare it to the image from the Sony A7. Not saying that the image from the A7 is terrible, but in comparison, what you're getting from the smaller bodied APS-C sensor camera is a better overall image. There's no argument there. Here's another one, and you can see the same thing applies here. The A6100 autofocus is tack sharp, nailed the focus on the eyes versus what you're seeing on the A7 and the Tamron lens, which just falls a little bit short. I was expecting the A6100 to perform better than the Sony A7, but not by that big of a margin. And that's really where the title of this video comes into play, is ultimately, while you could pick up an A7 for $500 or so on the used market, I think you're better off spending the same amount of money on a Sony A6100. Overall, it's going to be an easier camera to live with. You're going to be able to shoot sports photography. You're going to be able to record 4K video for as long as you want. This is a much better camera if you're just starting out. Even if you're an intermediate user, this is going to give you better results. Even as an advanced user, I think that optically, the images that you're going to get from the A6100 are going to be superior to those from the Sony A7. As for me personally, one of the biggest benefits to Sony mirrorless cameras is excellent autofocus. Sony nailed it with the A6000 and everything after the A6000. It took until the A7 III until their full frame cameras really got up to that standard that they set with their APS-C line of cameras. So the A7, the A7 II still fall under the old, slow, not as accurate, not as reliable autofocus. Whereas these cameras, the APS-C bodies, are amazing. So my opinion, stick with APS-C if you're shopping between these two. Now, if you have the money to splurge and get an A7 III, that's a different conversation, but A7 to A6100, A6100 gets my vote every single time. Thank you guys for watching. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about buying an old full-frame Sony mirrorless camera versus a newer APS-C camera body, because it's an interesting conversation. Also, let me know if you want to see a more in-depth video between the differences between these two cameras, because I could do that. As always, thank you for all of your likes, comments, and support. Stay tuned for more, and have a nice day. Bye-bye.